Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
Coming to you from these United States in America, a very chilly America. But we're glad to have you with us here on The Uncommon Good. I'm Bo Bonner. You probably know me from the Catholic Morning Show here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud, where are people familiar with you?
Yeah, I'm at Mercy College of Health Sciences, downtown Des Moines, training the future healthcare leaders of America.
We are happy that you are with us. We're going to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients for underwriting our show. I have no proof that better food makes you warmer, but if it's the case, Bud, the cattle are probably asking for a lot of Imogene Ingredients right now because it is incredibly cold outside.
Yeah, I know in your younger days, and I think up till now, you're kind of a weather buff, Bo. So I'm sure you... Were you kind of being entertained a little bit by the arguments over the models about that coming winter storm in the South?
Yeah. So, and also like having people down, on the ground in the trenches. It's interesting how much more accurate all of that stuff has gotten. But you also have to be careful because if you predict a big storm and it doesn't show up, that makes people less likely to listen to the next time. But what a coincidence! What a weird thing!
Yeah.
Wild and wacky, as the kids say. But what's not wild and wacky? Imogene Ingredients. It's there for you. Thank you for underwriting the show. Bud, speaking of wild and wacky data, today we're going to talk about some variances in people making proclamations that Catholics, do they outnumber Protestants among young people? The evidence ultimately isn't clear, and we can get into that. But what this is going to spur on for us is a discussion about why, in this cultural moment, maybe it's the case that something people have written off as a possibility, becoming more and more something that young people look forward to. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. We do appreciate it. But there was a data kerfluffle this last week or so. It looked like for a bit there were people who seemed to have evidence that Gen Z, so not the youngest generations, I know older people like us get confused about this, Gen Z, so basically the generation that has now finally become young adults,
right?
That there appeared maybe that there were more Catholics than Protestants. In the meantime, there's been disputes about the evidence. It's this particular study from 2023. And when you get population and demographic studies, they take a few years before they really get out, and then people really dig into them. It might not be the case, because it was, of course, small, right? It was like 21% identify as Catholic, 19% as Protestant. Among this group, there's statistical variations. There's reasons people are thinking that maybe this isn't the case. But it is intriguing. It's also intriguing about how much I think people thought this was significant enough to really dig into, because this would be something for the first time in the United States. It's also the case that it brought up interesting points that even in the midst of what seems like something like a revival, like it's something in the air, there are multiple people pointing out that there are still more people leaving the Catholic faith than entering into it. I do think that a lot of these things have to be taken with a grain of salt. Part of that grain of salt is it does seem like the speed in which people leave the faith to versus who are coming into it has very much stalled out compared to the massive rate that we had been seeing for a while. Also, it's sort of, what are you going to say about what a 21-year-old tells you, things like this. But I think the main occasion that this is bringing up and why this is interesting is not so much like, are we going to all of a sudden like be demographers and try to prove with math one way or the other. It does, however, I think it's fair to say that there's an observation that some sort of cultural moment and change is seeming to happen. And your uncommon good friends, Bo and Bud, we want to dig into this and try to get beyond just the sort of headlines aspects of this, or even easy answers, either confirming this or going against it.
Yeah, conversations around this topic are always fascinating to me. As you point out, it's kind of disputed just how significant this shift is. I do think it's a shift, Bo. I mean, you go back to 20th century United States, and it's a predominantly Protestant culture. You think about the roots of our country. I know the Catholic roots are sometimes overlooked, are not given the same airtime. Of course, like Franciscan missionaries here very early. Some different parts of the country had important, Catholic cultural moments. But really from the early 19th century up to around the time you and I were born, there was definitely a heavy Protestant influence. And if other parts of the world, like if you ask Catholics in Europe, like they look at America as sort of a Protestant country. So you do see this shift going on. And for me, Bo, like you were kind of gesturing at on the show, when we see these sort of developments taking place, part of our question is like, as Catholics, how do we respond to this sort of thing? And I see a couple kind of knee-jerk responses. One is sort of like a cheerleader crowd, like, yeah, the shift is taking place. That maybe ignores some of the evangelistic problems that are built into sort of people continuing to leave the church. But it also asks the question, or begs the question, I could say, raises the question, why do we get excited about a predominant Catholic culture? And I think part of that is a good instinctual response. Obviously, we want people to be part of the church. We're excited to see folks responding to the call of the gospel. There's a lot I could say at this point. I'll kind of pause and let you jump in. But I do think, and this kind of goes back to our formation in graduate school and some of the theology that we studied. If you saw a major shift, like if this trend were to sort of continue, that would be something to celebrate on one hand. It would also raise certain sort of like challenges for the church on another.
I think, to try to point out some reasons why, even if we don't have studies that bear this out, or if the numbers are confusing, the reason why it seems like, and beyond just Catholics noticing this, because it is starting to raise up in sort of secular publications and things like this. On one hand, Europe actually has a lot to do with this. Europe, again, in no way is anyone acting like Europe tomorrow is going to be re-Christianized. But places like France, where things like conversions were absolutely moribund, has experienced huge turnarounds percentage-wise for them. And that is something that they're actively talking about. The sort of French secular elite is really worried about this in some ways. And so like that is in their national conversation. The sort of taste of Europe we hear the most about, because they speak English, is the Brits. And pretty uniformly, the Brits are saying, for the UK, it's surprising how many people are coming in at Easter and things like this. And again, the Brits would never be overzealous to act like something is bigger than it truly is. But they really do say that something where like the idea that this could turn around and Christianity written off among the young is simply not there anymore. Something much of a more compelling situation. So I think, Bud, when Americans hear their European counterparts having this sort of at least mini revival or notes of a revival, as it were, we begin to look at ourselves and see if that's the case. I think that one of the things you have to do to like be mindful of the numbers versus the narrative, and this is, I think, going to get into exactly your question, is I think it can still be the case that in predominantly old Catholic parts of the nation, a lot of people are leaving. But when it comes to people considering becoming Christian and maybe getting back into practice of Christianity, I do think what you see for the first time in a long time is a lot of young people thinking, why not the Catholic Church? Yeah. And in America, predominantly, the idea of either I wasn't Christian or I was barely and I wanted to get back and like take my faith seriously is a predominantly evangelical narrative for a long time. And I think that that's what we're trying to say is, on one hand, mainline Protestantism has been in a skid for a long time. Yep. And for the first time in a long time, evangelicism, I'm not saying that it's in a skid, but it sort of has its own sort of issues among the young, maybe associated more strictly with political identification maybe among the young than Catholicism. But I do think that that's the difference, is you can have two things happening. It can still be statistically that more people are leaving the faith, especially as it were in historic cultural places where you would be cultural Catholic, and there still be this feeling that among the young who either were unaffiliated or barely affiliated, that for the first time in a long time, Catholicism seems to be a major contender for when they either join the faith or get back into it. And I think that that is the pulse that people are beginning to feel. This is when they talk about going to Newman centers or college campuses or things like this, that there has been a trend towards pews being full, more people joining the church than there has been in a long time. And so that's why I think there can be two things going on at once, and why the discussion of what we want from that and why it seems important enough that people keep talking about it. I actually think it's that that dissonance between the sort of two sociological groups that makes the conversation seem so important.
Well, no one's ever going to confuse me for a sharp prognosticator. I think any sort of prophetic sort of foresight about the future can be tough when it comes to nations and cultures. But I do think, Bo, we're on the cusp of a major shift. And the reason I say that is, okay, I'll do kind of a shots fired moment.
Yeah.
I think like secularism as a culture is really difficult to sustain. If a culture doesn't have a transcendent reference point, whatever that might be, it tends to fizzle out very quickly. And I think you see that in different parts of the West, especially, where folks sort of don't have a reason to care about the next generation. I don't know. I mean, some of it's kind of sad. I saw a report this morning that there are today in the United States 40 million Americans who live alone. Mm-hmm. And so you have sort of this loss of a family life, of sort of like a cultural, artistic life where people feel like this is something worth sustaining. It's kind of the trend of like, well, I'm going to eat Grubhub and watch Netflix in my apartment after I get home from my job. And so part of I'm hesitant to make prognostications, but I think if you just look at demographic shifts, like the way that our culture exists today, I don't see it existing in this form for a long time.
Right.
Now, that being said, I don't know what comes next. I would hope it was a robust Christian Catholic culture. I do think there are other traditions, some of them, Islamic and neo-pagan, things like this that are...
Well, and nationalism, right? It's like this idea about like, what would I do? Like you said, what matters beyond myself, right? So, yeah.
That are sort of filling that vacuum. And that's where this is sort of the practical question for Catholics. I do think when we have that conversation, it's tempting to say, how do we develop a strategy for sustaining what's been handed on to us? Mm-hmm. And that impulse isn't bad per se, but Catholicism has never been precisely about civilizational maintenance.
Right.
And I think even when we think about something like Christendom, which had a lot of gifts, and I'm not going to bemoan it, I think it was a culture where grace infused parts of life that don't have that same infusion today. The great figures, especially saints who sort of birthed that reality, I don't think they thought to themselves, like they had Christendom in their minds and then they tried to create it.
Right.
I think they responded to challenges in their time, and then Christendom is sort of what happened.
Yeah, so, I mean, that immediately makes me think of a few things. On one hand, you talk about the loneliness epidemic, which now has a major talking point among many groups of people, so not just Christianity. And one of the things that's interesting is this goes back to my long adage that revolutionaries usually can have a point and try to improve things, but their grandchildren usually struggle. And what I mean by this is every sort of revolutionary thinker almost always was trained in the system that came before. So like just speaking for academics, for instance. So intellectually, they have this absolute intellectual grasp. Like I always bring up Emil Durkheim, who sort of was this revolutionary guy in sociology. That guy knew multiple languages. He knew the classics. He was brilliant. And so when he tried to take down what he saw as the flaws of the system in sort of his field, and especially in the field of religion, whether he was right or wrong, what you could at least say is he knew what he was talking about in terms of his ability to know the field and at least, speak to it. The problem is not Durkheim, it's Durkhamites. They probably have a better name for themselves. But if you don't have the erudition of the old order like Durkheim does, and you just base off of like what he said, you can quickly flatten out what was probably, I'll say outright, well worth considering by religious believers, the criticisms that Durkheim had. Responding to his criticisms is very important. But the people who followed who didn't have the sort of prior knowledge that he did, their criticisms are not nearly the depth of what he was bringing up. So, but in a similar way, I can understand the criticism of a culture that sort of idolizes family and especially only sees religion as like functional to make a big family, right? I have a big family, you have a big family. We all understand, like I don't think anybody's going to get on us for saying we don't support families. But of course, I can understand the idea of feeling like your life is like overly determined or like there's not opportunities. I understand all that, bud. But when you're the person who, quote unquote, and I mean this in big quotes because I don't believe it, escape the sort of strictures of like a family or a small town or whatever, you, of course, go into the new lonely situation with all of those virtues, all of those benefits, right? And so that first generation, as it were, who lives a big old life on their own, of course, has all of that backbone. If they wanted it, A, and B, they've been formed by it. The problem is the next generation and the generation after that, those generations don't have any of that formation. They don't have that big backbone. And at the same time that we send out a bunch of people acting like freedom and doing what you want was the best way to live life, we also completely gutted community life. Yeah. So I think that people, the first few generations that are like, I'm going to break the chains of small town life and being a family, I'm going to go out on my own, they of course benefited from robust social interaction, third places like people say, that of course were made by middle children, people with multiple siblings who knew how to communicate. As that withers away, this now becomes cruel, right? That you just send people out at the same time that you've gutted community. And so, yes, it makes sense, right, that same group will start to look back at something like Catholic understanding of families, Catholics that have big families, Catholic churches that try to create community and see like, oh, this is a place unlike what I'm used to. But to your point, what I would only caution, and I think this is where we're going to get into, if the only reason that you decided to join the Catholic Church was because I'm lonely, like that's a good entry point, and I think it's something we should be very proud, cognizant of, face forward about. We believe in community because we believe we're the body of Christ. But if your only idea is you should come hang out with us because you're lonely otherwise, all of us have dark nights of the soul. All saints face loneliness, and not all communities are perfect. And we need to be careful of acting like the only selling point for our faith rather than the truth about Jesus Christ and God and the church. If all it is we have community, you got to be careful about when community doesn't necessarily knock it out of the park, if not in year 1, in year 10, etc.
Well, I think this gets to your point about people mistaking what we might say about family life. I think whenever you and I talk about a good that can become an idol, that a listener may mishear like, oh, they think this is a bad thing. But there are goods that are great goods that can get in the way of us and God. And I think about that, Bo, with even prosperity, or how do you say it? So when we talk on the show about the common good, that gets into, faith, it touches on every aspect of life. So how we organize our cities.
Human flourishing.
Right. We're like, obviously as Catholics, we're concerned about that. But whenever these topics come up, and I put them under that umbrella of like the idea of like civilizational maintenance, it can become a sort of idol. And who I go back to, of course, is St. John Henry Newman. So when he touched on this topic, he's writing like 1860s. And you think about that historical moment where the quote-unquote Protestant empires that had emerged were very impressive. And so it was a common apologetical point among Protestant writers to say, well, just look at the United States, look at Britain, look at the Dutch Empire, and compare that with, not to pick on anyone, like Spain and Italy, right? And they're like, these places are humming, and because of their Protestant culture. Now, Newman is very nuanced about this. I don't have the time today to get into like the full depth of his argument. He does think the grace that the church brings to cultures makes those cultures better. But he makes this whole point that Catholicism doesn't exist to make the trains run on time. It doesn't, he says the church would exchange all the suffering in the world basically to prevent one venial sin. And he makes it in a much more like rhetorical, powerful way than I just did. But he says like the church exists to sanctify human beings, and the mystical body of Christ in the world is a witness to God's coming kingdom. But we can't just make this about sort of comparing practical outcomes among different countries and cultures.
Right. That is I know where Newman's taking it. He says that is what Protestantism decided to do. Mm-hmm. And I know that can seem very mean, but he's saying this in regards to specifically the English Reformation.
Right.
Where what Henry VIII, in many ways, if you put it as many down to brass tacks, was literally about a civilization's maintenance. Right? He thought he had to make this argument because he wouldn't have an heir if he was following what the Pope said. And I know you can get into real specifics about was the Pope being mean or whatever. But the idea, right, is as much as Henry VIII in multiple facets of his early life talked about defending the church, you could tell by his very willing readiness to throw all that away in order to get a version of Christianity that better fit his imperial instincts and what he wanted to do with his kingship, that he meant all of that only insofar as it was subservient to the good of the state, which is why he had no problem deciding that the king was the head of the church and doing what he did. And of course, what we're not saying is if you appeal to Gen Z because you're willing to have bingo night or whatever the Gen Z version of bingo is and get people in, to the parish functions because no one else offers them a social life with any sort of depth or meaning. I'm not trying to say that's the same thing as Henry VIII declaring himself head of the church because he wanted to have a new wife. But what I'm saying is something else that Newman quite honestly points out again and again. All of the good things in life are intrinsically worth doing just for their own sake, even if nothing came from it. To be virtuous is its own reward. To be healthy is its own reward. To have that philosophical habit of mind, that intellectual perfection that he talks about in the idea of a university, worth it for itself, even if you got no job from it, that you derived no other benefits. But of course, the thing is, if you are virtuous, if you're healthy, if you have that philosophical habit of mind, you can do nearly anything else better than the person that doesn't have it. But the trick is you can't get it if you are only trying to get the effects. You can, unless you care about the cause for its own sake, none of the things follow. And I would say the same about the faith. Christianity, and Catholicism in particular, has benefits for society unmatched. But you lose them if you only are in it for the effects of Christianity and you never truly get the effects. And then that becomes the next time we have people falling away from the faith that are going to go, I was promised X, Y, and Z and I never got it. What we must say is Christ is worth it no matter what. And what you'll be surprised by is what you'll get in addition other than that. I know we're up on the break, so, do you have any 1 minute, golden things to say to that?
Well, I think what I want to come back to in the second segment to give a little preview is I think what we're facing when we think about this cultural moment is a couple things. And one that I struggle with, Bo, and one thing that I find helpful on the show is that sometimes you walk me back from the fatalistic bridge.
I try.
And what I have in mind is going back to where you talked about how things changed, late 20th century, because it really seems like the structure that was in place that enabled this thick culture was eviscerated. And as someone who's kind of more traditional liturgically and has some conservative instincts, there's a part of me that wants to say well, if the church wouldn't have changed these things, everything would have been okay, or at least better than it is now. But it was so complex. And when you look at a place like Des Moines, these communities that existed in the heart of cities just went away. And it wasn't always something that the church did. It was it was the influence of contraception. It was the move to the suburbs, all these sorts of things. And so what do we say about that sort of thing? And then the second piece that I think would be interesting to talk about in the second segment is just if this trend of Catholicism increasing in the United States continues, what do we do then in the sense of, some people have talked about the dangers of cultural Catholicism. What do we say about cultural Catholicism? And I think you and I's take on that question is probably going to surprise a few listeners as well.
Well, yeah, the chronic idea that when something happens, don't break your arm patting yourself on the back. What do we do if it's truly happening like some of this stuff begins to indicate? Let's not sit back on our haunches and celebrate. Let's be honest about what that looks like to make this plant, this flourishing, keep happening. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Thank you for listening to the show. We'll be back after this. Here's to everyone out in listening land. Hope you're staying warm. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. Bud, by way of metaphor, something you said at the in the last segment. Hopefully, this will get us rolling again. We're talking about, that different evidence seems to say that if not, Catholics have actually outpaced Protestants among the young. That there's indicators that maybe they're getting close. This is also against a bigger backdrop of that we're still losing a lot of people, but against an even bigger backdrop that at least culturally there feels like there's something different, which was unpredictable even maybe 5 years ago, right, among young people in the Catholic Church. And so what we're asking is, if this is true, even if it's only a small seed, so regardless of how big the seed is, if it's true that something's going on, what sort of thing does that require for us to be prudent about, this sort of grace-filled time that maybe is coming to fruit? And one of the things that I want to say is I was intrigued by that you pointed out. You said that I walk you from the ledge of things, which is funny because I think sometimes people would not think of me as Mr. Optimistic, which I don't think I am. But I want to reinterpret through a metaphor maybe what happened where we had this downturn. I mean, I don't think anybody is silly enough to act like Catholicism in terms of just people belonging to the church has been in a near free fall, at least since sometime in the 70s. And again, like you pointed out, people often make a too easy idea about what precipitated that and why. And I think there's all sorts of causations, and I don't want to absolve everybody from those things. But it's certainly the case what you said is there was going to be sort of cultural evisceration happening no matter what, right? Like around 1970, beyond like Catholics, America faced massive waves of change that had a very large effect on how people understood themselves and the community. And Bud, my metaphor is this. So, I literally thought of this because you talked about thick social descriptions. Yeah. So I was thinking of thick in terms of me. Like I'm thick, meaning I'm a big guy, Bud. And funny thing about a poison compared between me and let's say you, circa 2003, when I met you, right? How much did you weigh at that point? Like 120?
Well, when I got married, it was 185.
Yeah, you were a skinny guy is my point. And so the point that I'm getting at is if you and I accidentally ate the same food with the same poison in it, other than like if we were otherwise healthy the same, by the sheer fact that there's more of me to absorb the poison, I would be more likely to live. Because I'm thick enough that the poison wouldn't probably affect me as much as it did you as a smaller man. Now, what I want to point out is I think that sometimes what we need to give the church credit for is there's all sorts of things that did not survive in any way the poison that was a host of social circumstances. One, obviously, the sex revolution and things like this, but multiple things happened. And Bud, if we start to think of it that way, that what the church in the United States faced is not sort of this declination narrative that can't turn around or, this idea of inevitability. If what we want to say is for all of its faults, whatever else the church did, is it built a culture that upon getting this sickness, upon the poison of the 20th century hitting it, was able to weather that, even if it looked brutal and sad and like worse for the wear for a while, that what we're dealing with now is not some sort of, needing to overturn what happened or like save things from the brink. What we have is someone who has recovered from a deep sickness. And what we should start to see is the ways in which the body recovers and how we want to promote and actually even stoke the areas where it's recovering, but also not forget, right, that health is a holistic thing. And so what we need to do is not just, even if this seed is happening, what we don't need to do is just say we're going to double down, triple down on this revival in this one section. But in encouraging that, start to ask in what way can that moment of healing help the rest of the body get better. And I guess that's my saying is like, if you truly were like poisoned and were on the, like a ventilator and you barely survived and you started to get better, you go, hey, the minute that like your legs start to work, let's get you walking, right? Because walking is going to help your lungs. It's going to help your circulation, things like this. And that, I wonder if that's one of the better metaphors to think of, is if we have something reviving and it's really grounds for hope, in what way do we go, let's make sure to harness this to help the other parts of the body that still haven't, as it were, recovered from that societal poisoning, rather than acting like it's a lost cause?
Well, it's the harnessing question that I struggle with, though. So, very quick history. I think Catholicism sort of thrived in the United States in the late 19th century up through the early 20th. When you think about a lot of the like institutional building and things that were done, because we were perceived as not as welcome.
Right.
And so in a predominant Protestant culture where there was these suspicions of Catholic immigrants, the Catholic immigrants built really thick cultures to sort of like, when you landed on these shores, there had to be something in place where even like at the basic level of survival.
Absolutely.
So I'm a Knight of Columbus, and we talk about this a lot. Whenever Father McGivney's name comes up, it's like, well, Father McGivney wanted to protect families if the father died at a dangerous job, which is happening fairly often, right? And so the schools that we built, the hospitals, etc., part of those were a sort of good cultural maintenance so that Catholics had kind of like a safety net, a sort of like soil within which they could put roots. What I struggle with now, Bo, is we're all aware of sort of the issue, and it's larger than even sort of like intra-Catholic arguments. And what I have in mind is like the book Bullying Alone, Robert Putnam, right? There were these forces that, to me, that's where I talk about the fatalistic ledge. It just felt like a cultural tidal wave. The advent of the automobile, digital technologies, increasing education across the board. We sort of like across American life, most of us became more comfortable. That led to increasing mobilization, a movement in a lot of cities to the suburbs. And I mean, it was just a fact of life that a lot of these like thick Catholic cultures were sort of located, their foci was urban centers, and that was eviscerated. And so for me, there is, even on my part, when we talk about harnessing this strategic moment, there's a part of me that's like, why don't we just rebuild what we had in the past? But I don't feel like that's going to be what actually happens.
Because it's not, because you can't repeat the past. It's an interesting thing to think of, right? That why Catholicism uniquely thrived as it did in the United States was because it actually was leaving a world where it used to be culture sustaining, culture building, right? They left Christendom and came to a place that was not Christendom. And so, as you said, what was necessitated was for them to, of course, do these things themselves and be, and to not worry about fitting into the larger culture in a way that the people, their ancestors, did. Yeah. And, as people have to time and again recognize, there was obviously something wrong with European Catholicism, or they all wouldn't have come to the United States. And part of that may have been much more secular and all sorts of things happening with Europe, but it's certainly the case, right, that some of those things came about precisely because of the decision Catholics in Europe chose over hundreds of years, that then made that entire groups of Catholics came over here, and as you said, could no longer just assume that, since you're in a Catholic country, you're going to do things this way and it's going to be provided for you. Yeah. I do think what happened pretty quickly is the minute American culture was like, hey, do you want to be part of our Christendom? A lot of the church, and it's not even true, a lot of Catholics were more than happy to do that. And so when you think of sort of like Catholic heyday, when even in like the culture, Catholicism, like you look in the 50s into the 60s, which is, I think, is where some of these debates about what kids are finding appealing in the past or whatever, and nostalgia. It is certainly the case that you can go watch movies like On the Riverfront or whatever that is. I'm saying it wrong, I think. There's all sorts of movies like that are right about the 50s. It was obvious that America's like, hey, do you want to be part of American Christendom? And the church said yes in a lot of ways, because that's something that even if they themselves didn't experience it, that was like deep ingrained, right? Like coming from European Catholicism. And then I think it was an unfortunate thing, like you said, within a decade, that sort of American Christendom disappeared. And the sort of middle line institutions that made it possible all started to crumble. And so the church it was in a very sort of weird place, which I think, to my mind, Bud, sort of populates a lot of the debates in America subsequent to Vatican II. So there is no going back to that, because Catholicism now, it isn't well, let me back up. There's two choices in this way. You can't go back and rebuild the sort of immigrant to American shores building their own thing mindset that, like, the Italians, the Irish, the Eastern Europeans, like that sort of stuff, that's gone. The only choice you have is if you would let the new immigrants to the United States take that torch.
Right.
And there's various reasons where it seems like American Catholics who aren't immigrant, should say the grandchildren of the immigrant generation we're talking about, is not being as open or welcome to that idea. But one option of what you're talking about, to bring this back, is to say, let immigrant Catholicism take the torch again, take the flag. The other one is to say that, of course, that even those immigrants, of course, have lived a very different life. On one hand, they probably have been in the Western Hemisphere as Catholics far longer than the group we're talking about. But then the other is just that it's a completely different economic and social situation, right? It's hard to imagine to come over to the United States and make an ethnic enclave like some of the Irish and the Italian immigrants did. It happens somewhat, but I mean, Bud, without getting into the politics, when that happens, American political discourse seems to not like it.
Yeah.
And they didn't like it back then. There were know-nothings, right? There's a lot of anti-Catholic immigration. But how is the church going to conceive that if that's going to be the engine and fuel of revitalizing in the way that you're talking about?
Well, and that's why I think there is a balance there where I don't think the right response is to try to resurrect the past. On the other hand, Bo, I don't think we should be deterministic about these questions. There's always prudential discernments that take place in cultural moments. So we've already sort of mentioned the ethnic enclaves of the past being eviscerated or going away. There is creative ways to respond that aren't identical, but do something, I think, sort of unique. My thoughts go to when we lived in Pittsburgh. There were a group of young Catholics who moved to the same neighborhood, and they were intentional about building a network of support. Now, it wasn't what their grandparents did, but it was kind of cool to see, and I think there were some real strengths in that sort of response. And that's where, you and I have always warned on the show against devising strategies for outcomes. We don't know the future. Part of our task as Catholics in each generation is to say, how do I sort of fit into the biblical narrative? Because we've talked about the biblical narrative being symphonic. It has these different witnesses. And part of that witness is there are times where you've got like a Moses figure who is kind of crafting a culture and giving laws that set the stage for a robust, obviously not Christian culture, but religiously informed reality. And then on the other hand, you've got times in salvation history where God's people are living in exile. And we might be entering an exile moment. And I think part of the faithful response would be to say, how do we learn from what someone like Jeremiah did or Daniel, something like that, in our own time and place? But on the flip side, I said in the first segment, we might surprise folks with our take on cultural Catholicism. So I kind of come from a background, just to lay my cards on the table, where I have relatives and friends who are suspicious of cultural Christianity. Mm-hmm. And what they say is well, Uncle Ned, I'll say Ned because it's a rare name these days, he goes to church maybe once a month or just say Easter and Christmas, but he drinks too much and he cusses too much or whatever, like the particular sins that they want to identify or whatnot. I hate that kind of conversation. I think it sort of ignores how each of us were deeply, deeply relying on grace to be brought to where we're at today.
Right.
But secondly, that God's grace is still active in someone's life, even if they have all these sorts of flaws, right? And that's where, like, sometimes I see this sort of, and maybe I'm allergic to it because it more is something that I kind of like left behind, but I see a response to the cultural moment that says part of our task as Catholics is to sacramentalize cultural Catholics.
Right.
And we have to be a more welcoming parish. We have to get folks to realize it's not just about going to Mass on Sunday, like punching in and out, but it's like it's attaining a sort of like a deeper kind of experience. And I know what's driving that outlook, but I think it ignores like a really strength of cultural Catholicism, in that it sort of keeps people on the hook as they grow in the life of faith.
Yeah. What I want to return from quote unquote cultural Catholicism is Catholic guilt and being haunted by sacraments.
Right.
And I know that would like, people go like, what are you talking about? You wouldn't even know it. You're a convert, everything like this. But I'm like, look, I'll give you this. Before I was Catholic, what impressed me the most about Catholicism was bad Catholics. And what I mean by this is I worked at a homeless shelter. 2/3 of it were people barely hanging on to the Catholic Church. And it would even say that they didn't agree with it, all these things, right? But you know what they did, bud? They were all guilted enough to go work at a homeless shelter. And I know that many of them either were well in the possibility of coming back, or randomly would do things like go to confession or things like this. And I'm with you. I believe in human fallibility enough that I don't want a cultural Catholicism that makes the sort of social accoutrement, like the sort of like cool things that happen because you're Catholic. I mean, I love Catholic art. I love all of these things. But if all it is like, oh, when Catholicism becomes cultural Catholic, neato things are easier to do. Like, I'm less interested in that. Although even then I'd be like, hey, that's great if instead of liking terrible art, you happen to like Catholic art and you don't know why. Great. I'll take that over bad modernist art. What I'm actually interested in, though, is for the person who's going to be a tortured soul, and bud, they're probably going to be a tortured soul no matter what. What I don't agree with the modern world is a tortured soul, if they were just given unlimited freedom and they didn't have all this guilt, they would live a happy life where they... the only way that could work, as you're saying, is someone who has a conscience. If we could just kill their conscience, bud, that's what they're getting at. If they could just be total hedonists, maybe they wouldn't be happy. But all we have to do is look at the secular nations that have the rising problem of suicide, state suicide, where people allow this right. Like, that's not going well. Tortured people are tortured people. If they are tortured by grace, there's a real chance of redemption. There's a real chance of deathbed conversions and becoming Catholic at the end of life, or even if I don't know what I'm doing, when the situation called upon it. Those were the sort of deep roots that I went to. I am much more worried, about how the people who are barely hanging on, if they are given a chance to barely hang on. And in that regard, I'm with you. Absolutely. Yeah. That's the cultural Catholicism that, like, I want the people who are brokenhearted and the flame is all but dead to have a true chance, to have the spark reignite, rather than saying, I want it to be easy for people to come hang out with the Catholics, as much as I'm glad that they do that when they do.
When you were talking, a quote from Fulton Sheen came to mind, and I'm probably going to get this slightly wrong, but he basically said that the church is intolerant when it comes to its principles because they're divinely given, but tolerant in the case of individual persons.
Right.
And I think wherever history takes us next, when we talk about like proclaiming the faith here on Iowa Catholic Radio, part of what we have in view is the truth is the truth, and you have to hold to that steadfastly. But the church is always abundant in mercy, and when we think about the pros and cons, like the sort of strengths and weaknesses or particular temptations of a Catholic culture, one of the strengths is this kind of clinging tight to those principles, and it's only in so doing that I think mercy is made available. So as we're having this conversation, I can't help but think about Brideshead Revisited,
right? And
there's the father figure who he ends up being with another woman, right? Like
he does all sorts of stuff.
He separates from his wife and he's living with someone else. And there's this moment, I'm not going to get it like Waugh does, but he says something to the effect like, no matter how far the guy went, like God could pull him back with the tug of a thread. And that's sort of a metaphor for grace. But the tug of the thread is possible because of this unbending holding fast to the principles. If the church said, well, we see that like folks can't live up to what we've said about marriage, therefore we're going to like tweak things a little bit, that moment of grace couldn't really happen. That being said, what's tough for us as persons is like when you look at the life of Christ, he was able to always teach the truth, but to do so in such a way that folks still felt like mercy was being extended to them. I think his encounter with the woman at the well is probably the most amazing instance of that sort of reality. That's really hard for us to do as fallible Catholics, but it's one of the challenges I think that we face in today's world.
I think it was Waugh who, if he didn't say this in Brideshead, he said it somewhere else. And it's certainly true of his friend, very much different than him, Graham Greene, who sort of lived out this reality as well. And let's be honest, even Waugh, mostly a terrible person otherwise by his own admission, and it was the barely hanging on that the faith was. But they say something to the effect of the deathbed conversion, like the reason it's a final act of humility is because it's so cliche. Yeah. Of course it's a deathbed humility, and there's all sorts of people who were mad at Waugh when he wrote Brideshead Revisited because it was so cliche, right? The guy left, blah, 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 and there was this grace. But of course, that I know that the character in there was talking about this, and then Waugh has talked about it again as well. The reason that cliche is cliche and then it keeps happening is because it keeps happening. And the sort of final thing that a proud person who thinks they can run away from the string has to do is to admit there at the end, here I am, humiliating myself by saying, I am one of those cliche deathbed conversions. Mm-hmm. And what the church says is, that to me is the culture. You want the culture that can allow those cliches.
Yeah.
Because the humility involved is to say, I'm not special. I realize I need redemption. It's very much the course of the human to run around and try to rebel as much as they can. But that is the sort of like ultimate humiliation to say, like so many others before, like the prodigal son, I have come back and I've asked just to be able to eat what the swine eat. And what he has said, slaughter the fattened calf, for my son who was lost is found, he was dead, and now he's alive. That's the culture we need to make. If that's what these seeds we've been talking about is indicating, I'm all for it. I just want us who are, us converts, people who are in the faith, to make sure that we don't get stuck on the happy feeling of the sort of surface level things.
Right.
And what we want to say is how do we make that culture, the culture of the cliche, where people will come back like time and again, the prodigals that we are have done. And if we can do that, then Bud, I truly am welcoming and happy and feel blessed to be living in that, if that's what we are seeing. This is The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Again, I hope everybody's staying warm. It is dangerously cold. Please make sure to take care of yourselves. This is The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. Bud, as always, powerful. Hopefully, we didn't say anything that made anybody too angry, but if you got mad at us, we're just trying to warm you up on this cold weekend.
Well, I know we're short on time, but when you were wrapping up there, I thought to myself, if this is taking place where more young people are coming back to the faith, one thing that we can say definitively is when they come, make sure that we're giving them the gifts of the church, like the heritage of the church. When we came into the church, part of the act of humility on our part is, what do you ask of the church? I ask of faith. And so we say to them, we give you baptism, we give you the saints, we give you the body and blood of Christ. And that's what folks are hungering for.
Amen.
If you're hungering for a life of prayer, please do join us in our prayer life. You can pray the rosary with us on air. Well, you won't be behind the microphone, but in your home as you listen in your car. 4:30 a.m., 6:30 in the morning, 10 a.m., 8:30 p.m., the Chapel of Divine Mercy, 2:57 in the afternoon. You can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
Thank you, Bud. And folks, we are a ministry that is more than just the people behind those mics, behind the board, or behind the desk. It's your ministry as well. You have made it possible for 20 years. Here's to hoping for 20 years more and beyond. You make it possible through your prayers, like Bud was saying. We appreciate that. by your volunteer times, your talent. We appreciate our volunteers immensely, but also your treasure. This doesn't happen except for the material support that you give, and you can do that by calling 515-223-1150, text 515-223-1150, or go on iowacatholicradio.com, hit the donate button to safely and securely donate to Iowa Catholic Radio and make sure that this station keeps on keeping on. But as always, thank you for a wonderful show.
Yeah, thanks.
This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.